Picture this. It's a Saturday evening and you're getting ready to watch your new favorite show. Because you have taste, that new favorite show is, of course, BBC Sherlock. As you're making your way through those 90-minute episodes, there's a few thoughts that keep going through your head. Really, you're just marveling at and slightly jealous of Sherlock's ability to remember so much, deduce, and make judgments. You might also be a little envious of his blue eyes. While I can't help you with that last fact, seeing as how I look like the exact opposite of Benedict Cumberbatch, I can tell you that those other three thoughts you're having are actually abilities that anyone can gain. Let's look at Sherlock's ability to remember so much. How does he do it? Well, using his mind palace, of course. But what is the mind palace? On the surface, it looks like a lot of hand gestures on Sherlock's end. He's kind of like cosplaying as like Dr. Strange, and there's a lot of vocalization. But in actuality, Sherlock is visualizing a palace in his mind, and he's moving through that palace, peeking through the rooms, trying to find information he needs to solve his cases, information that he had left there prior. This information includes the names of military composers, chemical compounds, and even those tiresome conversations he has with his older brother, Mycroft. Now, the term mind palace is really just fancy speak for the method of loci, which is a method that originated in ancient Greece and is most closely linked to the poet Simonides. And essentially, the technique is just that. You kind of take a mental walk down memory lane. I guess in a way you could say that Simonides was the ancient Greek Sherlock before Sherlock. Let's move on to our next thought. Wow, Sherlock's really good at deducing. Now, I'm going to hold your hand when I say this, but most of the time, Sherlock isn't actually making deductions. To explain this further, let's look at the arc of knowledge. We start off with our facts at the bottom, and the facts are what Sherlock's gathering at the scene of the crime, right? He uses those facts and those little details to come up with a bigger theory about what may have happened. And so this process is actually the exact opposite of deduction. It's called induction. Now, don't get me wrong, Sherlock also does the opposite as well, but that would involve him having some sort of general idea about something or someone beforehand, and then coming to a more specific conclusion. We can apply this to an actual example from the show, literally taken from the very first episode. In this episode, Sherlock makes an induction about his soon-to-be best friend John Watson's hand-me-down phone. He notices that there's a lot of scratches near the charging port, and there's a lot of scratches. That must mean that whoever owned the phone previously had a lot of trouble putting the charger into the charging port, and so maybe they have some issues with fine motor-like tasks. Through the power of induction, he somehow comes up with this theory that, oh, this belongs to an alcoholic. He ends up being right. Me personally, I would have thought that, oh, this was just someone who's really clumsy. But again, the show's called BBC Sherlock, not BBC Dasnoor. Now, the thing is, again, it's an arc of knowledge, right? So Sherlock very easily could have made a deduction from this. If he already knew that John had an alcoholic sister, he could have used that general theory to come to the more specific conclusion of, oh, this alcoholic sister is going to have scratches near the charging port of her phone. Moving on to our last thought about Sherlock. Wow, look at those amazing snap judgments. Well, the thing is, those cases of judgments are really just situations in which Sherlock is making attributions about people's behavior. And it's something that all of us do and can improve upon. Let's look at another example. This one, not from the show, just from the depths of my mind. We have two people here that Sherlock really cares about, his landlady, Mrs. Hudson, and John Watson, the aforementioned best friend. Now, let's say both of them make Sherlock something to eat. Mrs. Hudson makes him some cookies. Those cookies kind of turn out musty looking, as you can see. But it's okay, Mrs. Hudson, it's not your fault. This recipe is really hard. John does something similar with a grilled cheese sandwich, but unfortunately, Sherlock isn't as forgiving. He kind of interprets this, not even kind of, it is a character flaw on John's end. So why is it that Sherlock made two very different attributions for two very similar behaviors? We can look at this further using the covariation theory, which looks at the consistency, the consensus, and the distinctiveness of people's behaviors. In Mrs. Hudson's case, okay, does Mrs. Hudson routinely mess up this recipe? If the answer is yes, then consistency of this behavior is high. Okay, well, do other people also mess up this recipe? If the answer is yes, then consensus is high. And finally, can Mrs. Hudson actually bake other things? If the answer is yes, then distinctiveness is also high. So looking at these three factors, we can conclude it's not Mrs. Hudson's fault. The recipe is just really hard. And that's what we call a situational attribution. John, on the other hand, he can never get the recipe right. But the thing is, other people can make a grilled cheese. And so consensus is low. The other thing about John is that he kind of burns everything he makes. And so distinctiveness is low as well. In this case, unfortunately for John, Sherlock was right. It's just a character defect, and he probably shouldn't be allowed in the kitchen. Oh, but look, a secret third character enters the arena. Detective Inspector Lestrade. Now, as part of the police force, I'm kind of assuming that he knows how to make a good cup of joe. It seems like law enforcement kind of relies a lot on coffee from all the procedurals I've seen. But say for the first time, he presents Sherlock with a bad cup of coffee. This is the first time Lestrade's done this, so consistency of this behavior is low. It doesn't matter how other people, like how good other people are at making coffee. It doesn't matter what Lestrade's other drink-making behaviors look like. It's the first time he's messed up a cup of coffee. So we can assume that there's something going on in the wider situation. Maybe he just didn't have enough time to make Sherlock a good cup of coffee, or maybe he cheaped out on him for the first time. So, with these 3 tools under our belt, some of the tools that Sherlock uses himself when he's solving these cases, I hope that the next time you're watching the show and you're thinking to yourself, God, I wish I was a man in detective work, 6 foot, trust fund, blue eyes. Just remember that in the ways that really matter, I think we're all Sherlock Holmes.